there'll be a long stretch of me talking initially. Then there'll be a discussion about that in smaller groups. And then we'll have a longer stretch of talking, followed by another discussion, and then a very short amount of talking, and another short discussion, about 10 minutes in different groups. The aim of this is very much to give you enough knowledge that you can ask the right questions, but not necessarily to make you an expert on the energy system. That will then allow you to hold power to account on energy issues. Can everyone hear me for a start? Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Tom.
Good. Cool. I'm going to start by introducing what the Green New Deal is, go on to what energy looks like in the UK at the moment, talk about the different uses of energy and the different technologies associated with them that you'll often hear discussed in relation to energy. And then throughout that, I'll be talking about the challenges for the energy system and then what that means at a local level. So climate change is pretty much the centre of this and the centre of the Green New Deal. And I think quite often we can forget that what these numbers mean. So 1.5 degrees is not how much more warming we would allow. We're currently at about 1.2 degrees. So this isn't additional to now. These are the sort of different levels of global warming people talk about. A lot of international treaties talk about 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. But as you can see, if you get to 3 degrees, which is the current trajectory, we get into some serious and quite concerning things. And if we get to 6 degrees, we're pretty much dead, which is, you know, a sobering thing to think about. But it might sound like a small amount. It might sound like you've just put a jumper on, but 6 degrees pretty much is the difference between Earth now and Earth on fire, and us not being able to survive on it. Yeah. So the Green New Deal primarily aims to achieve a just transition away from our current way of living to a low carbon way of living, ideally achieving net zero by 2030, which is, you know, 10 years, to achieve 1.5 degrees of warming globally. And that takes into account the UK's historic impact on warming, and we should be cognizant of that throughout. It's an international challenge, and the UK has benefited massively from our emissions, and that's something we really need to consider in the Green New Deal. So it comes from the Roosevelt's New Deal following the Depression in America, and would be expecting to achieve net zero well ahead of the current legislation, which is aiming for 2050. But it focuses on structural and economic change rather than actions at an individual level. It's very much like the New Deal is a massive program of infrastructure and legislation to change the economy by encouraging community and national ownership so that ordinary people see the benefits. And it also creates millions and millions of well-paid, unionized, secure jobs, which isn't necessarily something we did last time we decarbonized the economy, when we closed a lot of mines and various other things. With coal. Sorry, it's just a moment. So energy in the UK, I'll start with that and what that looks like at the moment. The energy sector is massive, but it also underpins the whole economy, as I'm sure you're all aware. But importantly, those jobs are well paid, and they are, in general, quite good jobs. And importantly, renewable energy has even more jobs than the general energy industry. So a transition towards renewables, which is a major part of the Green New Deal, would allow for greater employment and greater number of really good jobs. It has a really high salary. It underpins everything across the economy. So I'll start with, what does Coventry's carbon footprint look like? And, you can see there that the biggest things are food and waste and consumption, but also transport and domestic energy use. But importantly, 60% of that you can call energy. And that's the key element is when I talk about energy underpinning everything, 60% of emissions at the moment come from energy. That would have been higher a few years ago, but for reasons I'll show you later, we've done some really good work on this and reduced those emissions. Most of the energy we use in the UK, you can see on the left-hand side, is currently fossil fuels, is coal, oil, and gas. And those are the fuels we use the most. Some of that is direct electricity, which is things like nuclear power plants and renewable energy. And a lot of that is also burning waste and burning plants, in essence, which is what biomass is. But it's used pretty much by three major sectors, and those are the three sectors that I'll break this presentation into. So electricity is about 20% of energy use, heat is another 20%, and transport is, heat is another 40%, and transport is another 40%. A major part of the Green New Deal is phasing out fossil fuels, that 75% of energy, and transferring that to renewable and zero carbon sources. So I'll start with electricity, which is the smallest of those three, but very much is the one that I think most of us are most familiar with, and perhaps the one that has most permeated into sort of general understanding. I'll start talking about this as well because it's a major solution. A lot of the solutions are including electricity and increasing the amount of electricity we use to move away from other fuels, particularly direct burning of oil and gas. So the energy system in the UK is pretty much entirely privatized. It starts with fuels, and that fuel might be wind that goes into a power station, that might be a wind turbine or something. And those are owned by private companies. So you can see here a number of different utilities companies, some of which I'm sure you'll recognize, some of which you'll probably recognize slightly less. Often they're the same as the people who supply you energy at the end, but in most cases, in many cases they're not. In many cases they're a different company entirely. Often they're an entirely separate bit using the same branding. That then goes through the system operators, which is the large cables. That's the stuff that distributes electricity around the country. That's the big lines. And then Western Power Distribution in our area. There are 5 different in England and different England and Wales, and different ones in Scotland again, that distribute it locally. So that's the telegraph poles and the things that get it to your house, in essence, from the substation to your house. But what's notable, and then the energy supplier supplies it to you at your home, and I'm sure you're all familiar with a number of those names on that list. But what's important is it's fully privatized, and almost nothing, no other country in the world has a energy system that is privatized to this extent, particularly the distribution networks, the National Grid and Western Power Distribution here, which are monopolies because you only have one set of cables, because having 2 would be very, very inefficient. But what's important is almost the whole system is underwritten by the government. So even though it's all private profit, the risk is held by us, the taxpayer, and the government. The reason no other country does that is because, and the reason we underwrite the system as the UK government, is because electricity is perhaps the most critical national infrastructure, as I'm sure you're all aware, and it really requires long-term thinking. It requires you to think in the sort of 30, 50, even 100-year sort of timescales. And that can be difficult for a private company that's thinking about the next quarter or the next few quarters. The Green New Deal is seeks to renationalise these companies if possible, to allow them to work more long term and to have that direct control to accelerate the transition to renewables. And you'll see why that is very possible in a few moments. But it also looks at converting companies to cooperatives so that they can better match what communities need and bring that revenue directly to communities, particularly if the government of power isn't looking to nationalise or isn't warm to nationalising these things. And we've already seen these sorts of co-ops in Stratford-upon-Avon, we've seen them in Nottingham, and particularly in Bristol, where there's a cooperative energy company in Bristol that's now the largest supplier of energy to Bristol. So it shows that it is possible. It's possible in cities like Coventry, which Bristol and Nottingham very much are similar in many ways. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's entirely done by governments, but we can do it to an extent with the Green New Deal sort of operates on both those levels. So electricity generation in the UK is a good news story. 50% of electricity generation comes from zero carbon sources, so that's renewables and nuclear, which even a few years ago would have been pretty unbelievable. It's often called the British electricity miracle. What you can see there is the biggest, by far, is gas still. And that's partly because of the dash for gas that happened under the coalition government, and also gas power plants that have been built over a long time in this view to move away from coal under previous governments as well. But renewables now are by far the cheapest, and we'll come on to that later. But what we've done by primarily closing our coal power plants and moving to renewables is something quite impressive. What's notable particularly is that renewables usually primarily come from hydroelectric dams, but really in the UK we don't have many places in the that are suitable for hydroelectric dams. So it's quite impressive that we've done it even without hydroelectric to a really significant degree. So we mostly use solar and wind and biomass, which is plants in essence. So you can see what's happened in the last decade to the emissions from electricity in the UK. They've reduced by about 5 times from where they were at the start of, in 2008 and the start of the decade, down to 2020. And a lot of that is policies that were enacted through the Climate Change Act made in 2008 under the Brown government. And actually, it's so low now that particularly during the pandemic, some regions, particularly the Northwest, have regularly got emission intensity of 0. So we've had zero carbon electricity for an awful lot of this pandemic, particularly in some regions of the UK, which is a real good news story. So it shows what can be done when we want to, or when we have a real concerted effort. And the Green New Deal is looking to accelerate this move from fossil fuels and replicate what we've done in electricity to other sectors. Because this sort of shows it's possible. It shows we can do it. It's a really brilliant news story, and shows that other sectors can do this if you aim to do it. So electricity demand changes throughout the day, as I'm sure you're aware. Unlike this PowerPoint, there we go. Electricity demand changes throughout the day. So basically, overnight we don't use very much because everyone's asleep. During the day we start to use a bit more, but it's sunny. And then when we get home, we all turn the lights on, we turn the cookers on because we want dinner, and we also turn the TV on because that's what people do in an evening. And the grid currently has to react to that demand. And that can often be the challenge for renewables because they fluctuate throughout the day. And so I'm going to talk about now solar and wind and the challenges that leads. So with solar, you can have, on a sunny day, lots of generation, but it's all during the day, and it doesn't necessarily match the peak of demand. So you need something that can help you match that peak to what you've got. And on a dull winter's day, you get much less, and it can be hard to match those two. So you need some level of storage and something to help you manage the weather, basically. So renewables are very much dependent on the weather, and you need some way of modulating that impact from the weather. It's a different challenge with wind. So on a windy day, you have lots of it. You can easily power the whole country off wind, and a few other countries, frankly, in the UK. And on a day when it's not windy, you get nothing, because below about 3 kilometers an hour, a wind turbine won't turn. And this averages out a bit over the UK and over the grid. And by linking to other countries in Europe, so we have connectors that go to France and the Netherlands and Norway and various other countries in Europe that neighbour us, and Ireland, of course, that allow us to sort of aggregate this between different countries. But it can mean you need essentially there are three different solutions to this. Either you need overcapacity, so that there's far too much on a windy, sunny day, but also enough on a not very windy, not very sunny day. You can have something which you can turn off and on very quickly, and gas is quite good for that, to fill in the gaps. Or you need storage. And that's one of the big challenges, and we have storage at the moment. So South Australia has just installed an enormous grid that can store solar and mostly solar electricity for the whole day. And they haven't had any outages, any shortages, and they've been able to achieve that very cheaply, cheaper than any other kind of power, and was quite heavily publicized because it was done by Elon Musk and his company. But to supply, at the moment, we have 3 basic types of electricity. We have peaking, which is stuff you can turn on very quickly for those times when you need lots. But what it really shows is that you need a mix. And you also need something that can supply all the time and supply a base load. And probably the best technology for that we can do in the UK is nuclear, that doesn't use any fossil fuels. And that's the key thing from the Green New Deal, is that we want to have a base load that doesn't supply fossil fuels, and we want to have mid and peaking that can supply the electricity demand. But also the good news from a Green New Deal point of view, which is aiming to put people before just profit, is that all the low carbon sources are also better for people. So you can see nuclear is by far the safest form of energy, but you can see the magnitude that oil, coal, and also to an extent natural gas are worse than the wind, solar, and nuclear, which is what is feasible for the UK. And biomass is also much better than coal, which is usually what it replaces. But the real challenge for renewables and for low carbon generation in general is not the cost. Renewables are by far the cheapest source of energy over their lifetime. But the cost model and the financing and the cash flow. So in essence, low carbon generation costs more to build when you're not getting any money coming in. It then doesn't cost anything to operate, or doesn't cost very much. It costs something to operate, but it costs very little to operate, particularly compared to something where you need to buy fuel to burn. and it costs quite a lot more to get rid of at the end, simply because usually something like renewables, if you think about wind turbines, they're often in the sea, and that can be annoying. And also because things like the externalities, so the cost of the mine isn't included, or decommissioning the mine often isn't included in the cost of decommissioning the power plant in a way that it is with a wind turbine. And also this decommissioning can last a long time, and that's particularly a problem with nuclear, is decommissioning on a nuclear power plant can last between 30 to 50 years. In fact, none of the nuclear power plants in the UK that we've turned off have been fully decommissioned, and probably won't be decommissioned until 2040. Well, currently are not planned to be decommissioned until 2040. But what's important is that when you look at those graphs and the cost of those different sources, fossil generation is almost always more expensive over the lifetime than either nuclear and particularly renewables. It's often slightly more expensive for nuclear, and it depends on the different pricing. But the actual cost is lower with nuclear and particularly in renewables. But the UK policy is for a private energy market, and that means we have private financing. In essence, companies have to get a mortgage to build their power station, and because low carbon generation is more expensive to build, they have to get a bigger mortgage. And if that is paid for by the government out of taxation, which is what a lot of countries do around Europe and also in America, the home of private investment. But if that comes out of taxation, the financing costs are basically zero. So the costs you see there are pretty much the costs. Whereas if the government pays for it from borrowing, the costs are about 2%, which means you end up paying roughly 1/3 extra. However, if it's privately borrowed at about 6 or 10%, you have to pay back maybe double or triple the actual cost. And that's where low carbon generation often is said to cost more, because if you pay for it using private financing and private borrowing, it usually is more expensive because private borrowing is very expensive. And that masks the fact that in actual fact it is more expensive. And is why often the companies that build these things are not truly private companies. They are private companies run by other countries' governments. So for example, the nuclear power plant being built in Somerset at the moment, Hinkley Point, is being funded by EDF, who are owned by the French government and financed by the French government, and a company owned by the Chinese government. And maybe finance, and it's underwritten by the UK government. So any losses are funded by the UK government anyway, while the profits go to private companies. And this is why the Green New Deal says that government investment is so good for energy companies, because they don't have these financing costs, and even if they do, they're so much cheaper. And also they can think in the really long term, in a way that companies, even companies that are owned by governments, really struggle with. Because if you're building a nuclear power plant, you're not going to finish looking after that nuclear power plant for 100 years, nearly 80 to 100 years. If you're building a wind turbine, you're still going to be operating that wind turbine, hopefully 25 years in the future. If you're building a power station, it's the same sort of thing. In fact, something that was built in World War II would still be decommissioning, just about to finish decommissioning this year. That's the sort of long-term thinking this needs, and why the Green New Deal cites government investment as so important, because governments can make those really long-term bets, and often do, or long-term investments. But as I said, the UK government policy is for a private energy market, which is still underwritten by the UK government, and that means that you get private profit, but with public risk. So one way you can still have a privatized energy market, if that's the policy that is required or is chosen, you can put a price on carbon, which really means that companies have to pay the true price for their harm, and incentivizes companies then to invest in lower carbon technologies, because in essence they're being taxed for building something that is bad for the environment. But that still requires a level of government intervention. It requires a government to set that carbon price, or something similar. There are a number of different ways you can organize it, but in essence, a price for carbon is very effective, but it's very hard to set because it's fairly arbitrary. It's fairly difficult to work out exactly the true harm of that kilogram of CO2. And it's also difficult to work out where that is happening, and can be a bit of a rabbit hole for governments, and can often not be as effective as we would like it to be. One way we can do, which is in the Green New Deal, whilst a government is not in power that wants to implement the Green New Deal, is to use something called green bonds, using, and this is also part of Coventry for a Green New Deal's 10 proposals for a green reset. So this is using either public or private capital that already exists, so essentially remortgaging things we already own, or using pension funds as well, particularly effective, and they've been effective elsewhere. And that can be private pension funds or public pension funds, to in essence invest in low carbon generation, which then gives you, and that uses that green bit there on the renewables, to that saving that you're getting to give good returns to the people who are using it, or using the financial product, but also can be used to reduce costs for communities, and community organizations and community companies that have set up these green bonds have been very effective in reducing costs for people, so reducing people's energy bills at the same time as decarbonising the energy supply for them. And it's not even that expensive. To completely decarbonise electricity would cost £300 billion, and decarbonising heat would cost between 450 and 120 billion pounds, depending on how we did it, basically, which is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but in the context of government and the British government, it's not a lot of money. It's 1% of GDP. It's sort of a similar size to a wealth tax. A wealth tax could do that very easily and not really impact very many people. And also, Britain currently has the highest fossil fuel subsidies in the world. And it wouldn't take many years. So if you took those fossil fuel subsidies we currently spend, over the next 30 years, and assume that they continued, that would easily pay for decarbonising electricity. Particularly given we're already subsidising electricity a little bit, but actually we're only subsidising renewables to compete with fossil fuels. We could remove both subsidies and just let them compete on their own terms. But I think what's really important is the cost of inaction. Not decarbonising would cost over £2.3 billion by one study. It's really hard to do these studies, but it essentially said, we don't know. But that's £2.5 trillion basically, and quite a significant recession. So the cost of action sounds like a lot, but the cost of inaction is much less, and really only because we've not taken the action we needed to over the last few years. As I said before, 40% of emissions come from heat. And the majority of that is generated by gas, although it is a lot more diverse. So some of that comes from electricity, and we've sort of just covered that. Some of that comes from oil, and that's particularly places that are off-grid. Places that are not connected to the gas network, which is still about 20% of the UK population, and biomass, which I'll come on to in a bit. So the heat system in the UK, again, is wonderfully privatised, and for many of the same reasons with electricity, this is potentially not a brilliant thing, particularly as most of the gas network and the heat system is a monopoly, particularly with Cadent, who are based in Coventry, and National Grid basically running the distribution network without any competition. So we don't get that competitive benefit. And again, having a fully privatized energy system, even for gas, is still pretty rare globally. But the difference with gas and with heat from fossil fuels is that we are very much dependent on overseas countries. And whilst those pipeline countries, so Norway and Scotland, are fairly friendly, Ukraine is less friendly, or not maybe less friendly, but potentially less stable is maybe a better way of putting it. And Qatar, and particularly Russia and the US, who we received a lot of liquefied gas from, so about that is potentially increasingly less stable. The US is not the reliable partner it once was. So moving away from fossil fuels doesn't just make us less, doesn't just make climate change better, it also makes us less secure. There are loads of other benefits from decarbonising the energy system that come with just making us a more secure country. But the real challenge for heat is it varies massively throughout the day, but also throughout the year. And that's a lot harder than variation throughout the day. You can see electricity there. It doesn't really vary very much throughout the year. It varies. Gas, however, and heat varies massively throughout the year. So you need something, ideally, that can not be on or not be used in summer and be used a lot in winter, and potentially be varied quite a lot. This is from 2018. And you can see that you might, if you follow the sort of trend line, expect sort of October there to be quite a big user of heat, but we had quite a warm October. So we didn't use as much heat as we expected to use. That's really difficult to have something that can respond to that. And particularly difficult if we were to lose just electricity. So again, you've got the challenge of, do you have a massive oversupply, which would be a huge oversupply? Do you have something that can react that is renewable? So the options are, fossil fuels is currently what you use, and frankly, fire is the best way of making heat. It sounds daft, but particularly for high temperatures, which is often used in industry more, the best way of making heat is with fire. And there's really two ways you can do that with low carbon generation. You can use biofuels, which are essentially plants. And there are some challenges around that. It can be turned into a gas or a liquid, or used as a solid to replace existing things and existing plants and existing equipment. That's its biggest benefit, so producing biogas, and I'll come on to an example of that later. But there are also challenges about, where do you get that plant from? Where do you get that from without competing with food and without using forests, basically? Are there better uses for that land? And then the other option really in terms of fire is hydrogen. And the challenge with hydrogen is it can be produced from water, and that's brilliant. However, it can't use most of the infrastructure. It needs the infrastructure that we currently have for gas, would need to be modified to allow for hydrogen. But also, most of it isn't produced from renewable sources. Most of it is produced from gas. And that's a problem because it can, in theory, be good, but at the moment, it isn't really. And it also is quite inefficient. So it essentially turns electricity and water make hydrogen. And that's quite an inefficient process, particularly compared to biofuels. And we'll come back to biofuels in a minute for a bit more information. There's then ways that aren't fire. So there's electricity, which would be quite an inefficient way of doing it because you'd have to build lots more and you can't really store electricity for months. You can store electricity for a few days, but you can't store electricity for 6 months, which is sort of what we need. There are also challenges with supply. So in essence, the only way you could then do that is by having electricity that can heat the country in January, not heat the country and have most of it turned off for a lot of the year. And that's a really inefficient way of anything working, basically, if you've got things that are turned off for almost all of the year. But it does work, and there is the infrastructure for it. It's a very mature technology. I'm sure lots of you have immersion heaters in your house for if there's no gas, or particularly if people have lived in houses that are oil powered because they're not on the gas grid, you will have immersion heaters for when that oil runs out, basically. Heat pumps are perhaps the most exciting way, though. So heat pumps take heat from the ground or the air, and they concentrate it, basically through quite a complex process, but they, in essence, even if it's cold outside, it still can be warm inside because they can concentrate the heat that there is. But they are quite big. They're not necessarily suitable for individual homes, which means you've then got to change how you live with a boiler. So if you live in a smaller house, it would probably make sense to have a slightly bigger heat pump that was shared between 5 or 10 houses. And that can be quite difficult because if one of those 10 houses doesn't buy in, what do you do? That can be quite challenging. But they are very, very low carbon. Although they are quite expensive to build initially, they are cheaper over the lifetime, which again is that same problem we saw earlier with the cost models. You need to have something at a more local level, which is where green bonds particularly come into their own, is government expenditure on individuals can be quite difficult. So they could make that choice, but often governments are more reticent to make that choice than with big infrastructure like power stations. But the other big challenge for heat, for any kind of heat, is the assets we already have. So the key thing with the gas infrastructure is it's there. We have it. Everyone has gas in their home, or most people have gas in their home. And if they don't, they have a different thing. Or certainly most people have gas hobs in their house, or they have gas boilers particularly, and that all needs changing. And you need to change the distribution network and the ports and all that other stuff. And this is actually true of the whole system. So we have the same thing in transport, we have the same thing in heat, and we have the same thing in electricity. So I've started with electricity as the example, and I'll then expand that to the heat, because I think we're more familiar with the electricity example, and it's a bit similar to explain. In the UK, we have all these power stations. You can see them on a map there. That's all the UK's power stations. But power stations have a long life. We have gas-powered power stations. So you can see one in Pembroke there, that big yellow-orange blob. That's a gas-powered fired power station that was built in 2018. That's meant to last 60 years. And if we're going to get to net zero by 2050, or by ideally 2030 under the Green New Deal, that's very, very difficult. So we'd either have to turn that gas power station off, or we'd have to somehow continue using that plant, because it takes a lot of emissions to build a power station. And there's a lot of money tied up in that and a lot of emissions tied up in that. So ideally, we don't want to just write off all those emissions and get rid of them. And you can see it's the same with waste plants, which are still quite polluting, and also with, to a lesser extent, with coal plants. But the main issue here is in the electricity system is gas plants. But also we've got all the gas pipelines that we currently have, and that's lots of gas pipelines that take a lot of energy to build and a lot of energy to it would be a big hit to stop using all those things. There's all the distribution installations, all the major gas consumers with all their plants, so that's a lot of industrial users who would have to essentially change everything. And all our domestic hobs and boilers that we would have to change if we went away from gas. And then there's the same with oil in terms of all the refineries, all the pipelines, all the filling stations, and all the vehicles that also exist on our roads that are currently in operation and probably are going to remain in operation for the next at least decade. So we need a solution. How can we decarbonize them quickly without writing them off? In fact, when you look at the embedded emissions in the gas infrastructure, if we had to replace the gas infrastructure, it's about a quarter of the UK's allowable emissions to get us to 1.5 degrees. So if we replace the gas infrastructure, it would take a big chunk out of our emissions, basically. But there are solutions. So biofuels in particular are a really good way of doing this. GRAS, which was for a long time the largest coal-powered station in Europe, and isn't anymore, was a gas plant that is now powered by biofuels. And we could do a similar thing with our gas infrastructure. So one project I've worked on is called GRAS, which converts grass to gas. Now, this solves two challenges. It solves the challenge of our infrastructure being designed for gas and being able to continue using that. And then to an extent, we could do that with hydrogen, although not if we wanted to use 100% hydrogen. We could use, at the moment they're testing 10%, and it seems to be going quite well. But you could keep all those pipelines, all that distribution, all the appliances in people's homes. But it also solves a big problem for agriculture. So a big part of the Green New Deal is that just transition and ensuring that people can keep their well-paid jobs and keep their livelihoods. And cattle are a big problem for the climate. I'm not going to touch on that too much, but I'm sure people are aware that beef is linked with lots of emissions. But if we are increasingly using less beef, over the last 5 years, demand for beef has gone down by about 20% in Europe. And that means farmers who have fields of grass aren't able to grow cows as much, or aren't able to get as much money for the cattle that they do grow. So what would be better uses for that grass might be using it to make gas, because a lot of these farms simply aren't suitable for growing crops for various reasons. Things like soy, and also cattle use a lot more land than not eating cattle, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So this offers farmers a different way of making money from their land without having to change everything, without having to leave the farm and close the farm and really change everything on their farm. It allows you can keep using those skills and not destroy those communities. But also it doesn't exacerbate the food shortages because that grass can't be eaten by people. And the protein that grass used to produce can be produced much more efficiently off a small proportion of that land. And that's really the challenge with any biomass replacement, is how do you not compromise either food or forests? And this is one example that has achieved that. So I hope that was useful. I hope people understood that the challenge there is, how do we not make stranded assets? How do we keep as many of the assets we have in use for as long as possible? And yeah, we'll go to another discussion on that for sort of 10 minutes again. Transport is really a thing on its own. It's massive, and I'm sure we all want to go to the pub and don't want to continue sitting here and listening. So if there's demand for it, we can do a separate talk on transport. But and transport is really entirely from oil. It's really a question of how do we replace oil. We've sort of touched on that with things like biomass and making biofuels from biomass using oil again. But really with transport, a second. It's frozen. There we go. With transport, it's just about using the lowest form of lowest emissions form of travel you can. So if you can get on a bike, get on a bike. Norman Tebbit was right. If that's not possible, try and see if you can use high-speed rail. It's always more efficient per mile. So this looks at per passenger mile. It's always more efficient per mile if you use something that uses long-distance travel. So something like a coach or high-speed rail are more efficient than something like domestic rail, just because they don't stop as much, because they go faster, those sorts of things. So you're welcome to screenshot this, but really, if there's a method that isn't flying, use it. It might delay you a bit, it might be annoying, but if you can fly, please fly. And another interesting thing here is that a car can be better than the bus if it's full. That really the key message is, use the smallest form of transport you can and the lowest emissions form of transport you can. It's moving down the hierarchy and just using the lowest emission form of transport possible, really. And that brings me on to the real way you can reduce transport emissions and all energy emissions effectively, is just by using less. And this is true of all energy. But the challenge for it is that using less is not necessarily an easy way to make money. So it's not promoted to the same extent as the other methods. Is using less is the best way, but no one's going to pay to market using less, because no one's making money from using less. And there's a number of ways you can do that. I've sort of detailed some here. You know, just traveling less. It's really simple stuff. Traveling less, traveling most efficiently, cycling where you can, trying to go on holiday without flying. The Lake District is beautiful, and coronavirus will also help with this, obviously. You know, cooking less, trying to wear a jumper. You know, some of this is really achievable. Some of this is more expensive. Things like insulating your house is quite an expensive thing. But actually insulating your body can be as effective as insulating the whole house with a jumper. And also the brilliant thing is the things that use less energy with food and with consumption. So buying less stuff, repairing stuff, doesn't just reduce the emissions from energy, it reduces the emissions from other stuff as well. So it reduces those industrial emissions, because the way to reduce those industrial emissions and those biological emissions in agriculture are the same methods as reducing the energy use. It's basically wasting less, using less, and a few other things. So things like using less meat, because meat is a very inefficient way of making food. Buying the most high quality thing you can that will last the best, repairing it and properly maintaining it. Also means you have to use less emissions to make the things. So yeah, that was just the short ending piece. I think we'll launch into a discussion after this next section. So what can we do ourselves? So technology can't save us on its own. We need a level of behaviour change with that to unlock the technology. You can see that 53% of this, according to the Committee on Climate Change, which is the UK's climate change group, basically, within government, say basically you can get no technology alone. You can get a 40% reduction. 40% of the reductions are just technology, but really you need behaviour change with that to get people to get that last bit out. Also, you need some behaviour change on its own. So that's things like wearing jumpers. But we need to make the changes as well. And, you know, all those things that we've said about doing the simple stuff, buying less, changing your energy supplier to a green tariff. They're usually cheaper. Companies like Bulb and Octopus, Ecotricity, companies like that. Or if you don't have control of that, ask your landlord to do the same. If your students, petition the student hall owners, make it a campaign. Traveling less, investing, if you have a pension in a green portfolio, which requires a bit of work, requires looking into. Many of us won't have control over that, but a lot of us will. Insulating your home if you've got money, and if not, doing as much insulation as you can. But also lobbying businesses, asking councillors, asking MPs and the mayor, what are they doing and why aren't they doing more? Educating those elected officials, educating businesses on what we could do to a green recovery, and the Green New Deal's 10 steps for a green recovery in Coventry that we've put together as Coventry Green New Deal are a really good place to start for that. And engage with those businesses and elected officials, and if they don't do what you want them to do, consider whether you want to vote them out or whether you want to boycott their products. Yeah, consider what you have a lot of power, and you can exercise that power if you want to. So I'll leave you with one message, and then we'll go into discussion groups very quickly, maybe for not quite 10 minutes this time, on any of the sort of last thoughts people have got on efficiency and on what you can do, and maybe to a lesser extent on transport. But I'll leave you with the message that inaction is a choice. It's a choice we've been making for quite a long time, not just us as individuals, but our elected officials and our businesses. But that inaction is an expensive choice. It's not a good choice, and it's one that maybe we should be, or we definitely should be stopping our society making. So I'll leave you with that message. Inaction is a choice.